I'm Shahar Azani, and welcome to this special episode of Eye on Israel. The fight for Israel takes different shapes and forms, but its most quintessential form is its literal one. Stand up for Israel on the front lines as a member of Israel's defense and security forces. Under Israeli law, national military service is mandatory for all Israeli citizens over the age of 18, men and women alike, for a duration of anywhere between 2 to 3 years and beyond. These young men and women put their very lives on the line for the Jewish state, and they are the ones who make all the wonders that we see in Israel today possible. Lone soldiers in the IDF are young men and women from all over the world who choose to leave the comfort of their homes and families to become proud member of the IDF family. Such a hero is our guest today. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, Cory Feldman moved to Israel and enlisted in the IDF. Cory served for 3 years in a specialized combat unit. He currently holds the rank of Staff Sergeant and continues to do his reserve duty each year alongside his team. Cory is an Ericsson certified professional coach, holds an executive MBA from the Quantex School of Business and Technology, and a master's in healthcare innovation from the University of Pennsylvania. Cory is a volunteer EMT with a Central Park Medical Unit, a published author, A Line in the Sand, and runs 2 podcasts, the Lone Soldier Podcast and Healthcare Reimagined, which can be found on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Cory wrote this beautiful book about his experiences and the path which led him there. As mentioned, A Line in the Sand provides a glimpse into Cory's thoughts, feelings, and experiences as an IDF combat soldier. Throughout Cory's service in the IDF, he searches for the perseverance, resilience, and selflessness to become something more, which he clearly has. Cory, it's such a great honor to have you with us right here at JBS Studios in Times Square.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
It's great to be holding your book. You know, I have to tell you, when I read the book, which I found absolutely fascinating, there was a sentence there that read, "It's not a chronicle of war, but rather a chronicle of love," you write. I love this sentence. Tell us a little bit of, what's behind it.
I think Israelis will understand, or anyone who's spent any great deal of time in Israel, but there's something, it's either in the air or in the water in that country, being our only Jewish state, where you just feel different about the place. I was in Israel a couple months ago on the Kinneret, and I remember looking out at this landscape, and I have feelings for this place like I have feelings for a person. It's love that I'm not accustomed to feeling towards anything other than humans, and so I'm still trying to make sense of it, frankly, but I do know that I love the country, I love the people, I love the morality on which the IDF stands, and so it was an obvious choice for me to go and do this after university.
That's actually a great opening statement, because you're talking about an obvious choice. And in the eyes of so many around the world who know less about Israel, it's all about war. And yet for you, who actually experienced it on the ground, even from the war perspective, it's about love. So I want to dig deeper a little bit to understand, where does it emanate? Where does it come from you? Growing up, you didn't attend Jewish day school. So where did your Zionism and love of Israel come from? How do we make more of you?
Well, I think we're all products of our environment. I think all of us, when pushed back. And so coming of age in a Jewish or non-Jewish public school, I became fascinated by Israel probably around the time of my bar mitzvah, which coincided more or less with the Intifada. And I was reading about Israel in the news, and I remember coming across...
That was the second Intifada.
The second Intifada, exactly. Right. Not that old. No offense. So, I came of age and was reading these articles and these headlines, and I started to notice this interesting thing. You would see a picture of a bombed out bus, and you would read, "Powell push-off talks with Arafat as bomb kills 6. So that's interesting. And you find another article, "Bomb kills 10 in Jerusalem." And then you'd see the headline, "Israelis kill 6 Palestinians." And it went on and on like this. I remember one of the articles that really jarred me was a picture of 2 women, and the headline was, two girls divided by war join in carnage. And this article goes on to compare a suicide bomber and her victim. And this really upset me viscerally. And so I took it to my, I guess then middle school history teacher and said, the New York Times is clearly biased against Israel. I'd like to present to the class about this. And she said, what are you talking about? You know, this is fair, even coverage. And so I think like most things in my life, when people tell me no, it kind of pushes me. And I think that's kind of what led me down the journey of becoming an advocate first as it related to how Israel was portrayed in the news and the media. But as that journey progressed through college, I felt this need to do more. And being in Israel, I think I was 16 at the time. I remember we stopped by the location of that horrible discotheque bombing, and I saw a father bringing challah to the gravestone of his daughter, and it stuck with me. It was like, I mean, there's no words to describe the tragedy, and unfortunately we're seeing some of that in this country today too, but you know, it's our people, it's our country, and so I felt like I needed to step up and do something more than just speak, more than just write letters.
So you're talking about, you know, this passion, this sense of belonging, but you're not at a Jewish school, so that must have emanated from your family.
Yeah, certainly. You know, I was raised conservative. You know, we went to shul on Saturdays here and there. And, you know, my parents raised me and my siblings to love and support Israel. And I think some portion of that push came from them, but also my own curiosity is kind of what led me to read and learn and become fascinated by Israel, which, you know, I hadn't visited many times until I entered my teens, or late teens, I should say. But I quickly felt this strong pull towards this country, both when I was there and when I wasn't there.
You know, we hear from so many parents today, too many parents, that the reactions they receive from their kids, even though they try to teach them the love of Israel, they go to college and then they come back with these notions of we were lied to. I don't know if you would know, but how were you able to avert that obstacle? Like, what was it in you that made you different?
It's a good question.
It's a tough one.
I think we all come to these things from our own perspective. And for me, having been there first when I was 12 or 13, I experienced the real Israel. I think a lot of college kids either don't make it to Israel in their high school years, or they go on birthright and it's a kind of a quick hitting trip. Right. I was fortunate to go with Hasbara fellowships when I was 19, and we got a really in-depth view of the politics of what was actually happening on the ground. We spoke with politicians in Judea and Samaria and Israel, and got a pretty good picture of kind of what was happening. And so I would credit, I guess, my education with shaping the perspective that I've held, which obviously continues to evolve. But probably personal experience is what allowed me to avoid kind of falling into that trap, if you will.
Right. You know, in your book, there was a name that was mentioned, which I think it's worthwhile to share with our viewers. Who was Joe Apatowski? What did he have to do with your journey?
Yeah, so Joe was a speaker for Free the Children, and was, I guess, 21 when I first met him. He was...
You were in school at that time?
I was in high school, yeah. High school. And he was just, you know, we had assemblies from time to time.
Right.
People would come and speak to the high school, and he was one such speaker. And he delivered this message about all of the tough things that are happening in the world that may not be obvious when you're growing up in a sheltered community like Scarsdale, particularly, I don't want to say pre-technology, but it wasn't the same environment that we live in today where everything's on the iPhone.
Right.
You had to search for these things. And I was kind of focused on my grades, college, girls, whatever high school kids are into, and not really aware of this other world outside of what I could see in front of my face. And so his speech kind of awakened in me this understanding that there was this whole big world out there, and it was worth looking at. And I felt kind of moved to do something. And it coincided with a trip to Israel, one of my first. And I heard kind of a lot of the calls for justice that he was speaking about reflected in what I perceived to be a lack of justice when people were putting their kids on buses not knowing if they'd see them at the end of the day. You know, to me that was a hard line where I said, this is not right. This is a Jewish state where Jews are supposed to be able to live freely and without fear, and that's not happening. And so I think those two things kind of rolled together and pushed me onto this trajectory that ultimately led to me enlisting. But Joe, unfortunately, ultimately passed away in a car accident on the way back to Canada after one such speech that he gave at a high school in the States.
So tragic.
And so tragic. He managed to speak to, I think, 700,000 high school students in his short life. And I hope and believe that there are others I know that there are others that he reached whose trajectories he altered as a result of his selflessness and his desire to change the world and belief that he could.
You mentioned it briefly, but I really want to just take a moment to review this. You mentioned the experiences, the horrible experiences of the Second Intifada in Israel, a time when almost on a weekly basis, if not more often, buses would explode, coffee shops, terrible, terrible terror that really washed the streets of Israel, cascading from every corner. And yet, just like you mentioned, you're here in Scarsdale. What made you care so much? It's far away. It's a reality that you're not really that intimately familiar with. It's much more easily, drawn in the direction of the anti-Israel camp and blaming Israel, like so many media outlets often do. How did that really affect you, and why?
Well, it was all over the news, right? And so even as a young person, I took interest in the news and newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, growing up in New York. And so I was aware of this thing that was happening because it was all over the news.
Right.
And, my parents have been involved in UJA for a while. And so I did have some exposure to these Jewish organizations that were putting out a narrative that was obviously very different from the one that a lot of these mainstream news sources were portraying. And so I think that's kind of what allowed me to see a fuller picture than one that I might have gotten just from these news sources that are not always friendly to Israel.
And it was that fire of justice that was burning within you, huh? Because it goes with you, just listening to you, it's quite clear that it's beyond. I mean, Israel is great and it's terrific that this is the goal that you have chosen for yourself. But from Joe's story of blessed memory and beyond, you're somebody who cares.
I try to be, yeah. I think, I'm lucky enough to have found a career where if I do it well, hopefully I can help people. And I think that's what motivates me.
And the reason I'm putting an emphasis on this is because I often say, exactly as you exemplify in our conversation, that caring for Israel is not just about caring for Israel, but it's really about standing up for what's right, for what's proper, for justice, and not just as a case in point of taking care of my own, because there is a terrible wrongdoing that's done upon many millions of people who live in Israel and are unable to convey the message as eloquently as you are able to in your speech and in your writing.
Well, thank you.
This is a very personal book. Like when you read through the book, you really take me on a journey. You lead me by the hand through your life. It's incredibly fascinating. And I want to pause for a minute on that moment when you first arrived in Israel. That major arrival, not the trips you made with the family,
right,
but the first time you land in, as you say, Eretz Israel. And I just want to, just for the sake of our viewers, go back to that moment. How did that make you feel?
Wow. So I guess it was probably June of 2010. It was a hot day. And
surprising.
Yeah, not shocking. I probably hadn't slept in a week trying to get all the things done that needed to be done to pick up my life and move to Israel. The hardest of which was saying goodbye to my parents at the airport. Seeing my mom so upset when I said goodbye to her was something that was really tough. You never want to be the cause of pain to people you love.
Honestly, just between us, nobody's listening. Did she try to stop you from going to Israel?
No, she was as supportive as you could ever expect a mother to be. She asked me for my reasons. She heard me. And both of my parents said, listen, we raised you to love and support Judaism and Israel. And so we can't then turn around and say, now you want to put your money where your mouth is, we don't support it. So,
but by doing that, she put herself on the line like so many Israeli mothers in many sleepless nights where, not knowing where you are, what you do, waiting for that phone call. And I can only imagine the hardship, the immense emotional difficulty of doing this from across an ocean away.
And now imagine doing it twice because my sister also joined the IDF. And so she had 5 or 6 years of sleepless nights.
Wow.
She's a tough woman.
Tough woman indeed.
But So, so I land, and it's chaos. You land on the flight, they announce, Baruch haba Yisrael, everyone starts clapping.
Right.
You kind of feel this euphoria on the one hand that you are moving towards this dream that you had, and then the other, this fear and uncertainty. My Hebrew wasn't great, and I knew that I had no idea what I was in store for. So it was kind of this surreal juxtaposition between these two perhaps conflicting emotions of fear and joy that rolled into one. It's almost that there's that Natan Alterman quote from Silver Platter, standing in the moonlight, erect in terror and in joy. It was kind of like that. I never thought about that until just now. But,
right. But honestly, sitting on that plane as it touched ground at Ben Gurion International Airport, did you have even a moment, a flicker of a thought of, I'm not getting off this plane?
I don't know. No, I'm far too excited by adventure to have ever talked myself out that early. Talk to me about being in the Shetach and basic training. We can have a different conversation, but
we'll get to that.
Then you come through the terminal, and there are all these Israeli teens with signs welcoming you to Israel. Just this festive atmosphere of like, welcome home. Like, where have you been? We've been waiting for you. And it was just such a special...
Who was waiting for you at the airport?
Who was waiting for me? We all came together with Gorin Sabar, so there was a bus, if I'm not mistaken.
So that's like the preparation group.
Yeah, so we met once a month in a hotel in Jersey, all the folks that would be moving to this kibbutz together.
Right.
And many of us were on that same flight. Actually, I take that back. I came early. I came, I think, prior to that flight. I was interested in seeing a girl who I'd been seeing when I was studying abroad, and I wanted to leave myself some time. So I'm remembering now that I stayed with my friend Josh, who actually joined the IDF after college a year before me. So I stayed in his apartment while he was on base. So no one was waiting for me per se. I just, you got that voucher for the taxi when you show up, and I had his address written down somewhere. And off I went to this street in Tel Aviv that I'd never been to, and that was kind of the start of my journey, lugging these two 50-pound bags behind me.
Wow. You mentioned the kibbutz, and for so many people the kibbutz is either a term planted in the past or something that they've heard of but they don't really know what it means. I just want to ask you, how was your time on the kibbutz? Like, what did you do there? What did you learn about the kibbutz that maybe you can share with our viewers who have not yet gotten the chance to experience life on a kibbutz? How was it for you?
It is kind of, as you said, a mix between the past and the present. They all kind of come together. You see these bombed out guard towers from the Independence War, and you feel connected to history, but you also have technology, anything that you'd have in any town or city. We had the very important job of building widgets that water the plants in supermarkets or grocery stores. You can imagine how exciting that was to a 23-year-old with dreams of the Special Forces, just sitting there. But they did let me out of that a disproportionate amount of time because I was the only one on the kibbutz who didn't have an Israeli parent. And so I really struggled with Hebrew. So I had ulpan for 5 hours a day. I would sit with my...
You didn't have any other lone soldiers in the...
They were all lone soldiers in that they're, a lone soldier is someone who doesn't have immediate family in Israel, but they all had at least one Israeli parent.
Oh, back where they came from.
So they grew up with some measure of Hebrew exposure.
Right.
My first Hebrew class was at 18 in college. So...
Wow.
Yeah.
And I know, I'm one to know that Hebrew is one of the easiest languages to learn, but...
It's amazing. It took me more than a day, right?
But that must
I was as shocked as you.
Yeah.
But, and I also have a learning disability that stems around shapes and characters. And so this specifically was like the nightmare.
Right.
And so I would sit with my mashakiot after my ulpan for an extra 2 hours. I would go back to my room with word lists and study them. I carried a notebook around and asked my friends to speak to me in Hebrew. And it's hard because you're doing this, you're preparing for this new life that's already stressful, and you want the release of being able to just relax. But I knew that was the time where I also needed to be speaking in Hebrew to work on it. So it was kind of this tension between wanting to relax. I'd stopped drinking in preparation for training and whatnot. And it was just all Hebrew all the time.
And how did you, did you receive any special support during your time on the kibbutz? Like, what made the kibbutz a special experience? Or was it not? Was it just like living with your friend in Tel Aviv? Or was there something different in the kibbutz?
I think what Garin Sabar has set out to do is remarkable and important. You know, you need a community to do something like this. You can't come back to an empty apartment. It's too hard. What you're doing during the week requires that you have that network. I think Garin Sabar has continued to get better at this. They now do Garinim that are specific to college graduates. Back when I was doing it, it was kind of mixed, and there was only 4 of us who'd been through college, and so it was a bit tough because there was not a ton that I had in common with the people that were meant to be my family, but I did have 4 or 5 college grads that I became very close with, one of whom is still one of my best friends. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a great experience in that sense. It was also far enough away from Tel Aviv that I wasn't able to be distracted by the lights and the bells, which was intentional to some degree, right? I wanted to come here and focus on this mission of service, and it required that I not be distracted by everything that Tel Aviv has. So I was grateful for the distance it put between me and all the fun stuff.
Right.
And it was a chance to kind of reconnect with like the real Israel. You know, I would say the real Israel, the Israel I grew up on, that I read stories about. You know, when I read about the founding fathers and building this country from nothing, like that's kind of what I pictured. I pictured the kibbutzim, and so to be there and kind of living part of that dream was a really cool experience. Experience
it firsthand. You mentioned Special Forces, IDF, enlisting into the IDF as a mandatory thing for Israeli nationals. It's confusing enough for Israelis to try and figure out where they want to land in the IDF, what they want to do, what they can do. Are they going to be sent somewhere, like navigating that? I can only imagine what it was like for you to even think about navigating that behemoth that is the Israel Defense Forces and trying to figure out your path. So where did you want to go in the IDF? Did you know where you wanted to be as part of the IDF? Like you had the notion of this is where you see yourself, or you were like, wherever I fall, I'm happy?
I think I would say from like 19 or 20, I had my eyes set on Duv Davan. I'd heard about that unit because the friend who I referenced lived on grew up on a kibbutz. His family grew up on a kibbutz with another family whose son had been in that unit, and he was one of the first ones I spoke with about the Special Forces, the tryouts. And, you know, today I think the IDF does a pretty good job on their site of mentioning the different places you can end up, the units, the tryouts. Back then it was all in Hebrew, which was pretty useless to me, if it was there at all. And there wasn't a ton of information out there. So all I knew was what I could gather from people that I had spoken with. And when he talked to me about his experience, I was like, oh, I want that one. So that's kind of what I had my eyes set on. I didn't think that non-Israeli raised soldiers could be in units like Matkal or Shayet at the Navy SEALs. But I found out that you then could be, so I kind of deviated a little bit and was like, oh, well, if this is an option, I want to try for this, being the overachiever that I am. So Matkal then became the target.
And tell me a little bit about that journey. Like, how did it work and where did you end up?
So by luck of a Google search, I came across this organization called Sevet Lochamim, which is a free organization that trains lone soldiers. These are typically present lone soldiers who, out of the kindness of their heart, in their 3 days off a month, will come to the beaches at 7 a.m. and run you up and down the sand dunes with stretchers and prepare you for what's coming in these tryouts. A lot of Israelis grow up with uncles, siblings, aunts who have served in these units, and they know what's coming. They do things like kosher kravi when they're in high school, which is basically training for these tryouts, whereas lone soldiers come and have no idea what they're in store for. So this organization, started by a friend of mine, Bernardo, and I guess implemented by a number of people who became some of my closest friends, really is what helped me understand what was in store for me. We would take the 3-hour bus, sometimes I guess Thursday night, to be ready for that Friday morning session, and really kind of understand what we were in for when it came to these tryouts. And I think Bernardo, Jacob, Daniel, the folks that trained me did a fantastic job, to the point where it almost felt like the tryouts were easy after going through that. It really prepared us well for what was to come.
You know, you're mentioning lone soldiers, so I want to focus on that for a minute. That must be a challenging experience, to say the least. So what would you say were the main barriers you encountered as a lone soldier in Israel, and how did you overcome them? Like, what's the upside, in your view, of being a lone soldier?
The upside. Such an optimist you are. Listen, the upside is that people have a great deal of respect for what you've done and what you've chosen to do. People are really understanding. Especially, my commanders were incredible. If I needed a day off to fix a phone bill, which was routinely 700 shekels, still don't understand how that happens. Yeah. Or one time where I was on base for 28 days and complained to a friend that I had no laundry. My commander overheard me and did my laundry for me late at night without being asked, without even telling me that he'd done it. That was the kind of support that I had within that country that was really palpable, even from as early as the tryouts. When you first end up in the paratroopers, you're put with kind of a group of random people before these tryouts happen, and these kids, for lack of a better word, were incredulous that I would come from America. They had a million questions. Right. Is it like the movies? Right. What's college like? But they were so supportive. When it came time to light the Hanukkah, because it was Hanukkah, they pushed me forward. They're like, you're the one lighting it, you're the one singing it. And I just felt very at peace. And I felt like I had found a community of people that understood the challenge and the commitment that I was making. I would say, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have started learning Hebrew earlier. I think a lot of the obstacles that I faced would have perhaps have gone away or been mitigated had I spoke fluent Hebrew. So that had its own challenges. It wouldn't have wiped away all of the issues, right? Israel's bureaucracy is notorious, particularly the IDF's, but language was a big sticking point.
I just want to say Israel excels in so much. That is also part where it excels. Like, the Brits may have needed centuries or thousands of years, hundreds. The Americans did it in a couple of hundred years. You give us just a couple of decades and we'll get that red tape going.
It's getting better. It's getting much better from where it was when I was there. Everything has become a lot easier.
Right. Well, that's now you're the eternal optimist, but that's Israel, isn't it? You mentioned the paratroopers. When many people think paratroopers, the picture that comes to mind is the liberation of Jerusalem, the Kotel. You get into the IDF and you became a paratrooper. How did that make you feel, now that you're actually part of, not just Israel's history, but Israel's very much present?
It was such a surreal feeling. I mean, I remember, when you do your tekes hashba'ah, where you swear and you receive your gun, and then thereafter you take it home on weekends. We arrived early and we walked the route that the IDF paratroopers took in the liberation of Jerusalem, and we listened to the broadcast where they said, Jerusalem is now in our hands. You hear the gunshots, you hear the chaos that ensues prior, and I was emotional. You don't want to cry around your peers, but it choked me up, because to your point, for a lot of Israelis, they know they're going to draft. It's a requirement, but I had chosen this, and I had chosen it because of everything that I had read about Israel's history. And I knew so much about, the liberation of Jerusalem and about those wars. And so to be kind of part of that chain was just this surreal experience. It was a dream come true of sorts.
Did you feel that your sense of history was equal, greater, or lower than that of your fellow Israelis?
I think it was greater, but I don't know that it's fair to them. First of all, they were 4 years younger, and if you'd asked me about my sense of history at 18, it might have been different. But when you have a path that's set in front of you, you don't necessarily have to do much research on what's going to be there. You're going to face it. When you're choosing whether or not to take a path, you want to research it all, understand what came before, what's coming after, as a means of making sure that you're making the right choice. And so necessarily in making an educated decision about drafting, I had to be more educated about what I was walking into. I think it's part of our blessing and curse of taking Israel for granted. I mean, thank God that we have an Israel to take for granted, but if there is one thing we can't and shouldn't take for granted as a Jewish people, it's Israel. There is a word that keeps on coming up in the book, and that word in Hebrew is acharai. Share with our viewers a little bit about what that word means, both literally and as far as its significance in Israel. After I told you about all my Hebrew problems, now you're giving me Hebrew tests.
Exactly, that's the key. I told you, optimist.
Acharai means after me, and it is the paratroopers' motto. Basically, it means we go first. So when there's a conflict, if there's a Gaza operation, the Gadsar of Tzanchanim will typically lead that operation and be first. What I've found remarkable and unique about the IDF is that it's a very, officers lead from the front. That's a unique thing. Even in the US, that's not the case. And it very much sends the message to soldiers that we're a team and we're in this together. And you lead by example. And I think that transcends the military experience into the civilian experience, the startup nation vibe. People wonder why there's more Israeli companies on the NASDAQ than all of Europe combined. And I think it's the leadership that's instilled within young people as a result of their military service, regardless of where they serve. It's also a much flatter command structure. You know, you call your officer by his or her first name, and you are expected to speak up if you see something you don't like. So I think everything that you learn as a soldier transcends the soldiering experience and builds you for everything that comes next. Yes. And Acharai is kind of one of the key tenets of that, which is if you want something done, go first.
You know, it's you're right. It goes far beyond the army. It's one of those lines in the Startup Nation book that was published a decade ago, yeah. And in which they're saying, what's the first thing that an Israeli employee thinks about when they come to discuss something with their boss? It would be, how come they're the boss and not I? So, in a way, Acharai. I want to ask you again, go back to the personal for a minute, because this book is infused with who you are as a person. And there is that moment, you know, the first time you're reuniting with your family when they come to visit you in Israel. Now you've been here for a while, they come to check up on you, see you, hug you, feel you. What changed?
A lot. Growing up in Scarsdale or any kind of privileged neighborhood, you have some degree of entitlement. It's you can't help it, right? You have access to great education, sports, and while Israelis were very supportive of me in the IDF, once you're in, you're not cut any slack. You're just like anyone else. And so that entitlement is stamped out very quickly. No one cares that you're tired, that you're hungry, that your knee hurts. You are a cog in a machine that has a very specific and noble mission, but a cog nevertheless, and you're expected to do what's required of you. And if you don't know that Yamina means right and you run left, well, then you're going to have to run faster to catch up with everyone who's running to the right. So I think it instilled within me a sense of gratitude because of how hard it was, not just from a physical perspective, but psychological, going from living on my own, being a senior in college, doing what I wanted, going where I wanted, to now being told how long I had to pee and where. It's a big shift. It's a big mentality shift. And so probably what changed most was I just developed this great sense of gratitude for every free second, for every minute off base, for every moment I got to spend with my family who I didn't get to see that much living in the States. I think that was kind of the major shift that happened in between.
And what about your family? Did they look at you differently? Did you behave differently? Did anything change in the family dynamics as a result of the Cory that they had met now after going through those formative experiences in Israel?
Well, you'd have to ask them, but seeing me on uniform for the first time, outside of pictures, made the experience probably a lot more real. It's one thing if it's words on an internet blog and pictures, but it's quite another to see this person on a uniform with a gun. And it was just an incredible reunion. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. It was this build up over such a long period of time. 6 months was the longest I'd gone without seeing my family. And so to be able to bring them to this place that was so special to me and show them why it was so special, and bring my parents to meet my commanders who barely spoke any English, but just the experience of being able to do that was awesome.
They say that Israelis communicate many a time in a nonverbal manner. So I think that that kind of worked out in those encounters, I can imagine. And also, exuding that warmth, like you mentioned the story about the laundry. truly touching, but very much at the core of that Israeliness. You mention in your book that sometimes you had feelings of sadness. You were despondent and angry with what you saw around you during your army service and beyond. So what propelled those feelings, and how did you cope with them? Because, you know, here you encounter the dynamics of the real world, beyond headlines, with all of the complexities involved.
I think the problems are not specific to Israel, but to any large organization, right? It's impossible for the folks on the top to have the full picture of everything that happens on the bottom. And so when you read about the Israel of Ben Gurion and those days, there's a lot of idealism infused into those writings. It's a clean slate, right, that they got to write, if you will. And the tensions that exist today between Israelis and Palestinians, while present, were arguably not as prevalent without the news to kind of put flame on the fire. Obviously not this network,
right.
Other networks.
Right.
So
we are dedicated for the truth.
Exactly. So I got derailed for a second. What was the initial question?
Sad,
right. So,
disheartened.
So, you know, then you're faced with reality, which is never going to be the same as what you read about, dreamed about. Amos Oz has a great quote: "The problem is not in the nature of Israel, it's in the nature of dreams. Every fulfilled dream leaves something to be desired." And Israel is indeed a fulfilled dream. Tel Aviv was,
it is,
100 years ago, was sand dunes. And now it's one of the most vibrant cities in the Middle East, if not the world.
But from a very young age, you were able to identify that and not take it for granted. That's very special, Cory.
Well, I don't know that I appreciated it as much, but getting there, I was, I guess, aware of the dichotomy between idealism and reality. And perhaps it was my first experience of that dichotomy, which is present in every aspect of our lives, not just here. But yeah, I think it's something that you have to come to terms with when, you know, not everything is going to be perfect, but the IDF exists to defend Israel. I still believe it's the most moral army in the world and takes pains to protect civilians that other militaries do not.
Right.
Doesn't mean it's perfect. And when you're on the ground floor, sometimes it's hard to see the forest from within the trees.
And when you say this, it means a lot and it reverberates, because it's not a talking point for you, it's a personal experience. And talking about experience, I just have to ask you, because this is such an Israeli-American point, Sunday morning. There is a big difference in the notion of Sunday morning between Scarsdale and Israel. Tell us a little bit about your experiences of a Sunday morning.
Sundays were hard. Sundays, so in Israel, the work week starts on Sunday,
right,
and you go back to base on Sunday. And in basic and advanced training, base was a horrible place where we were just sleep deprived and beat up legally, not like actually beat up, but you know. And so you just knew what you were going back to. The dichotomy between where you had been for the last 48 hours as you're finally coming into a feeling of, okay, I'm in Tel Aviv, I'm enjoying this. And just as quickly as that feeling comes, it's gone because you're going back to base. And what's kind of so interesting about Israel is that it's a defense force. We don't maintain troops outside of the country.
Right. Israel Defense Force.
Yeah, wherever you're going is a base in Israel. And so it's never more than a couple hours away. And you see people on the same buses as you going about their daily lives. They're going to work as a doctor, as a lawyer, as whatever it is they're doing. And you're going to this place that is infinitely more challenging and difficult in theory. I guess in the mind of a 20-year-old, at least, being an adult comes with its own challenges, as I've learned. But it was obviously a very different experience than the Sunday that I was used to. In particular because it was Saturday night for my friends back home who are still out at bars,
right,
texting me,
right,
or what was it, BBMing back then?
BBM.
And so the difference between my life then and now was made even more apparent by the time difference and getting those messages as I'm on the way back to suffering.
You know, we're running short on time, but I have to ask you this. Your personal experience, you served in Judea and Samaria, you served in Hebron, you served on the border with Gaza. At some point, you mentioned the stories of the infiltrations from Gaza, and you specifically referred to a scared, blind, folded 14-year-old, possibly with you making the New York Times cover. How did that feel for you? Like, did that feel real? And what did you learn from those experiences about the complexities?
Some of the realizations came with time, and the beauty of taking 7 years to actually finish this book is that I relived these experiences often through the eyes of a more mature person than the person that I was when I went through these experiences. And so it's not clear to me if I knew in that moment, as opposed to upon reflection, if I could draw the line between what I was seeing and realizing how things can be misconstrued. Because if that kid had not been captured with a knife and surrounded, maybe someone would have had to shoot him. Because when someone charges you with a knife, you have to respond. If someone is trying to enter an Israeli settlement with a knife to kill civilians, you have to respond. And you can imagine how bad that would look if a 14-year-old who's no longer armed is shot by a heavily armed IDF soldier. So I guess what became clear to me is how a single picture can capture a single moment that doesn't tell the full story. And also the tragedy of a world where a 14-year-old is brought up to believe that the best thing that he can do is take this knife and go kill civilians. You know, that's child abuse.
It's very true. After all of the training, you had that moment, right? When you actually took part in 2 operations, was it? It was Pillar of Defense and Protective Edge. How was that for you? The interesting thing that maybe is not as obvious to people who haven't been in the IDF is they think about, you know, the training and the conflict, but a lot of what you do is actually not that, right? You're trained for war, but then asked to be a peacemaker effectively. And so most of my service was trying to walk that line between keeping that aggressiveness that we were trained to keep in order to keep people on both sides safe, but also to be the peacekeeper that you need to be when you are guarding in a heavily populated civilian area. And so when this war broke out, it kind of changed the stakes. We took over a position on the border so that the regular troops could go in. And there were a lot of tunnels. You know, when I was at Nahal Oz in 2012, I remember hearing scraping. And you think you're crazy. You haven't slept. You're like, I must be crazy. In retrospect, there were many tunnels that ran right under that base. And, you know, so now we're part of this operation, and there were many instances of terrorists popping up all over the place. And so we had a number of scares where we got a report or heard a noise and would take off in the direction, having no idea what we were going to find. So it definitely kind of put our training and our ability to remain cool in high-pressure situations to the test. You know, there was a loss on the moshav or kibbutz we were staying on, so having the intimate experience of death of people extremely close to the people I was around was a real part of that time period. Obviously, the lone soldiers that we lost in that operation, I went to the funerals, and it's heartbreaking. You know, there's nothing else to say about it. You know, seeing a parent who's lost a kid, there's nothing worse. It is. You know, you beautifully write at the end. You have that sentence. You know, we started with one. We'll reach our conclusion with one. How your blind love for Israel grew into measured admiration for the tiny country that is home to the Jewish state. What does that mean?
As we were discussing earlier, the picture that I had of this country was of a dream, right? Of a fantasy. And so as I came to know it for all its perks and all its setbacks, I formed a more realistic picture of all that it was and wasn't, and was able to appreciate how, in spite of the hardship, which is not as clear when you don't live there and see it firsthand, both financial and from a security perspective, how these people are still able to thrive, to maintain their dignity and compassion, to still strive to become better. And Israel's not perfect, and the IDF makes mistakes. But I do think the IDF does its best to hold itself accountable. And the people who make up the IDF, in my experience, were compassionate people who don't have bad bones in their body, whose sole goal was to do their job and go home to their girlfriends, to their families, to their friends, and to move on with their life.
You know, the word compassion is an incredible word to describe. I always say Israel, the heart of a nation. You know, you also mention, you say your contribution to Israel was far eclipsed by all that you received and all that you learned in Israel, which I felt was a beautiful sentence, just to encapsulate who you are and what your book is all about. It still feels the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And even today, as I go back and do reserves, it's a reminder of what hard really is. You know, when your chiluf doesn't come after an hour and a half and you're stuck in the sun, it puts the rest of your life into perspective, right? You know, unfortunately, when I was in Israel 2 summers ago, a terrorist drove her car into a group of soldiers from my company. Fortunately, didn't hit any of them, but it's real. It remains real. Even when you're a reservist, the threats are real. And so you're forced to take seriously the job in front of you, to act with professionalism, but you also go back to your life afterwards with an appreciation of how much easier it is to be a civilian than it is to do the job that our boys and girls do every day, men and women, I should say, in keeping Israel safe.
So I can imagine the feeling of coming back and meeting them, you know, just getting back together on your reserve duty once a year or as often as you go. That must be a very special moment for you.
Absolutely. And we've grown closer, right? When we started, they were 18 and I was 22. Now our lives are much more converged. They're professionals. They're after college. They're with girlfriends or wives. So our lives kind of look a lot more similar. And there's a number of guys on my team that I've definitely gotten much closer with since we started doing reserves together than I ever was during our mandatory service.
You know, I think it shows that I could sit here and talk to you about this for hours on and on, because again, this is truly a very special book and you are a very special person. And looking at Israel through your eyes, even for me as an Israeli, is one of the great gifts that this book has. And I highly recommend it for all of you, our viewers, to take the moment to really read this book. And there is so much we can learn from Cory's experiences by going through it at any age, wherever we are in life. Really, thank you so much, Cory, for today.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Incredible. Thank you, Cory, for taking us on this most wonderful journey. And thank you deeply for your service for Israel and for the greater Jewish people. Just sitting here and listening to you is an inspiration, as I'm sure all of you, our viewers, have experienced on your own. And to you, our viewers, this is what I want to tell you. Cory's book is a wonderful peek into the incredible journey and the connection between American Jews and the American Jewish community and the state of Israel. It's a beautiful read, it's an enjoyable read, and I encourage all of you to take time off of your busy schedules and reading it. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time as we cast another very special Eye on Israel. Shalom and Leitraot. See you soon.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.